This is the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast from Advanta IRA, where we show you how to explore investments beyond Wall Street and open your eyes to new options for your portfolio. It's time to take control and give yourself the freedom to choose where you invest your money.
Hi, this is Alex Perney, and welcome to another edition of the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. Today, we're going to be covering a little bit later on the Inflation Reduction Act, which has been getting a lot of headlines in today's media coverage, and it's important to understand what this huge piece of landmark legislation actually means for reducing inflation and what it doesn't mean for reducing inflation. But today on the download, President Biden is expected to have a more formalized approach to his student loan debt cancellation, which was announced on Tuesday, 8/23. So today on 8/24, we're expecting an announcement of the actual details of what this student loan elimination is going to entail. Currently, we're expected it to be roughly about $10,000 of student debt for any taxpayer making about a less than $125,000 per year of annual income. So it'll be interesting to see what this is actually going to entail. This was one of the things that he campaigned heavily on. So it'll be just kind of interesting to see how it actually plays out on what kind of promises he's going to make good on for canceling student debt. A lot of Democratic lawmakers are calling for this as a little bit of a short step on what was actually promised. And obviously, a lot of people on the other side of the aisle are calling this, maybe a little bit short-sighted and maybe not necessarily on the mark of what is actually needed in today's actual climate and economy. But it'll still be interesting to see what actually happens with that. I expect this will be put out a little bit later on this afternoon. In gambling news, the expansion of gambling with the United States Supreme Court several years ago, more or less kind of legalizing it and leaving it up to states as to how they would like to regulate gambling. We're seeing a large purchase with Penn Entertainment, which runs Barstool Sportsbook, entering into an option agreement to purchase the rest of the media giant Barstool Sports for an estimated $387 million for the outstanding shares of the media conglomerate Barstool Sports. So interesting to see how this is actually going to play out with the large online sports book entering into a full purchase agreement for the media company Barstool Sports. Just kind of interesting to see really how this is playing out with companies such as MGM Grand and also Hard Rock expanding significantly into states that have legalized gambling to promote online sportsbook gambling and see exactly where that's going to go. Penn Entertainment has seen quite a large fluctuation in their share price over the past year, but with shoring up a full ownership percentage in the media company will certainly help them to promote their services a little bit better. Now, in real estate news, new home purchases fell to 12.6% at an annualized pace, matching the pace last seen in 2016 at 585,000 purchases. This is mainly attributed to the continued rate hikes by the Federal Reserve. However, prices are still up on new homes, 8.2%. For the new homes being sold to almost $439,000, according to reports by the Housing and Urban Development and the Census Bureau. Now, some news out of retail. Retail giant Nordstrom has lowered its forecasted earnings 5 to 7%, which definitely comes as a little bit of a surprise. This is being a surprise as the recent retail boom from several last week of earnings reports with Home Depot and Bed Bath & Beyond showing much different outlook on retail. Now, Nordstrom is citing a big shift in their discount market of their Nordstrom Rack division as the main culprit for this projected outlook slump. Now, Nordstrom shares have fallen almost 14% on the announcement of their reduced forecast model. So again, we did have some really good news coming out the other week on on retail in general, which was very surprising considering the overall reduction in the economy that we're seeing, the kind of slump that we're seeing in a lot of different markets, seeing retail actually bounce back with several of the big players posting larger than expected earnings reports, seeing something kind of go the opposite direction. While I do kind of think that it is expected, with everything else going on, just kind of interesting to look at. Now, with the economy going the way it has been, we have been seeing kind of a stabilization in our markets, with yesterday's trading actually showing pretty good across most of the major indexes, everything being up roughly a point to 3%. So definitely good news on that front. And futures for the United States markets are actually pointing in a slightly better direction. They're pointing higher as the Fed plans to be working in conjunction with several of their central banks to kind of coordinate in a coordinated effort to help to try to slow down the global economy, to help to try to combat inflation and to try to get us back on a slightly more healthy market, with almost everything seeing a significantly higher valuation than really what is sustainable for a lot of the market sectors, such as energy, consumer prices, things like retail, real estate, all these things being significantly overvalued for most economists' outlook. So seeing the U.S. futures market point slightly higher is definitely good. Bond markets are actually also pointing upwards as well, which is definitely a good thing to see, with regard to governmental debt issuances being a little bit more favorable for investors as well. So not a whole heck of a lot of news on the front of the markets. Things actually starting to point a little bit better. So with that said, this has been The Download. Today on the what is the discount rate? When you hear a lot of people talking about exactly what's going on with the Federal Reserve, you hear people talking about, or I should say, at least the media talking about raising interest rates and what exactly that is. Well, typically they're referring to what they're referring to is called the discount rate. Now, the discount rate is the interest rate charged to commercial banks and other financial institutions for short-term loans that they take from the Federal Reserve Bank. The discount rate can refer to either the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks for short-term loans, or the rate used to discount future cash flows in discounted cash flow analysis. Now, it's important to understand what this is, because once the discount rate is increased, that kind of has a trickle-down effect to everything else. So if it's more expensive for the banks to borrow money that they're in turn using to lend out, it's going to cause an increase in the actual interest rates that they're charging on things like home loans and auto loans and everything else like that. So when we're referring to the Federal Reserve hiking interest rates, we're typically talking about what is the discount rate. So it's important to understand, and I think a lot of people kind of overlook when you hear people talk about the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, they're actually talking about the discount rate. So I felt it was good to bring into this the context of this conversation. This has been the What Is. So, everyone's heard about it, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a humongous piece of legislation that was recently passed by the United States House and Senate and signed by President Joe Biden on August 16th. But a lot of people are saying that it does very little to, or is going to do very little to actually combat inflation. Now, today, I'd kind of like to take a dive into what exactly is included in this bill, because while we try to take a relatively neutral stance on a lot of things when it comes to cold hard facts and law, I think we can, all take a little bit of a more analytical approach. And regardless of where you kind of fall on the political spectrum, facts are facts, and reading through this bill, we're going to kind of understand exactly what it does focus on, and potentially what the effects are not going to be as well with regard to reducing inflation. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act has 8 major titles into it, so it's going to cover kind of a wide variety of different things. And I think just from me reading what some of these titles are, we're going to actually see, that this bill does contain a lot of pork, or things that were pet projects or other kind of special interest of certain lawmakers that are being pushed into it to kind of carry through things that maybe didn't have merit to stand on their own. So the 8 major titles of this bill are deficit reduction, interests in the Committee on Agriculture and Nutrition and Forestry, which is kind of interesting thing to lump agriculture, nutrition, and forestry into a title on a bill. Banking, housing, and urban affairs. Title 4 is commerce, science, and transit. Title 5, dealing with energy and natural resources. Title 6, dealing with environmental and public works. Title 7, dealing with homeland security. And Title 8, dealing with the Department of Indian Affairs. So I think just by kind of reading out the titles of the different portions of this bill, we can see that this is a very large spectrum of coverage on what exactly is being legislated on with this bill. So with that said, let's actually dig into what exactly is contained within this bill, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff that goes into it. And unfortunately, it kind of reads from the perspective of someone going into it of things that, yes, might actually definitely help to reduce inflation, and then kind of devolves once you get kind of to the end of it of exactly what this is kind of straying away from, which is hopefully the reduction on inflation for the U.S. economy and the U.S. taxpayer as well. So Title One, the Committee on Finance. This bill incorporates an alternative minimum tax of 15%. So the average annual adjusted financial statement income of domestic corporations. So what essentially it's doing here is it's going to impose a minimum tax on the adjusted income of companies. Now, this is going to exclude subchapter S corporations, regulated government investment companies, and real estate investment trust. And these companies do exceed $1 billion over a specified 3-year period. And the tax effective date is going to be beginning on December 31st of 2022. So essentially, it's going to try to increase the amount of taxes that we are seeing from large corporations, which I think will certainly help to fund government programs and help and aiming to kind of reduce the tax burden on the taxpayer, which again, I think reading through this can kind of be a good thing. It's also going to increase the taxes on stock buybacks. It's going to impose a 1% excise tax on the fair market value of stock repurchased by a domestic corporation after 2022. There are going to be certain exceptions to this as well. One of the big title things that people have been talking about is the increased funding to the Internal Revenue Service. Now, the Internal Revenue Service is getting a little bit north of $800 billion, which they are going to be utilizing in their own statements to kind of hire a significant amount of additional Internal Revenue Service agents. Current projections put that at around 87,000 Internal Revenue Service agents, which I just think is absolutely wild. And it kind of also paints the picture of why exactly they need so many additional IRS agents. It's going to be kind of impossible to say, and speculation is going to be speculation and it's contained mostly of hot air, of what exactly that's going to mean for the U.S. taxpayer. Are they going to increase audit rates? Are they going to be using this to kind of strictly focus on the increased complexity of reviewing financials for that alternative minimum tax? It's going to be hard to say. So with regard to that, the bill is going to provide additional funding for the Internal Revenue Service for taxpayer services and enforcement. It's also going to include operational support, business system modernization, and one good thing I do think is the development of a free direct e-file return system. So that way people aren't going to be so reliant on having to purchase things like TurboTax and other paid for programs in order just to e-file their tax returns. So again, trying to take a little bit of a burden off, but with TurboTax costing about $50 for a license, $50 to the average American taxpayer, I don't think is really going to go very far when, we have gas prices shooting up and the cost of goods, housing and everything going up so significantly. When you're talking about something that amortizes, to less than $10 a month for the average household, I think that's kind of a little bit of a, a little bit of an underhanded way to try to reduce inflation. But I do think it's good. I think it's something that every taxpayer should be able to, at least for free, be able to file their taxes. It also provides additional funding for the Department of Treasury, for the Inspector General and Tax Administration, for the Office of Tax Policy, increased funding for the U.S. Tax Court and Treasury Department offices. The one concerning thing that I do see in there is additional funding to the U.S. Tax Court. So what that means is that they're going to have more money for tax court judges, tax court lawyers, just in general tax court operating costs, which would kind of incline me to think that it's going to be something where they're going to be taking more people to tax court, which most people definitely would not think would be a good thing. Now, additionally included under deficit reduction is legislation on prescription drug pricing reform. And they're going to try to reduce the cost of prescription drugs by price negotiation. This bill requires the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, the CMS, Department to negotiate prices of certain prescription drugs under Medicare pricing beginning in 2026. Now, this is right now about 3.5 years away. So immediate cost reduction, not necessarily something that we can really point to. Specifically, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, must negotiate maximum prices for brand name drugs that do not have a generic equivalent and that account for greatest Medicare spending. So requiring negotiation on the most costly drugs for Medicare and Medicaid. The CMS must negotiate the price of 10 drugs in 2026, 15 drugs in 2027 and 2028, and 20 drugs in 2029 each year thereafter. Drug manufacturers that fail to comply with negotiation requirements are subject to civil penalties and excise taxes. I think this is definitely good, which is aiming to kind of try to get drug companies to reduce the cost of their drugs, specifically to ones that they are, that are being covered by Medicare and Medicaid. But I don't necessarily think that this is going to be as wide ranging as people think, because it doesn't necessarily include language that's going to keep them from raising the cost of these drugs for private insurers. In addition to this, the bill requires drug manufacturers to issue rebates to the CMS for brand name drugs without generic equivalents under Medicare that cost $100 or more per individual, which prices increase faster than inflation. Manufacturers that fail to comply with this, again, are going to be subject to civil penalties. This also provides funding through fiscal year 2031 to the CMS to implement these types of rebate programs. So again, looking at this, hopefully the thought is that with these kind of forced negotiations and price reductions, this is going to trickle down into the rest of the economy. And hopefully this certain aim will actually do that. But it's really kind of hard to say how this is going to actually play out. And also with the fact that this is not going to necessarily going to go into effect until 2026, the immediate term effect is, going to be zero. This also going to have a provision to improve the maximum out-of-pocket cap for Medicare beneficiaries. The bill is going to eliminate beneficiary cost sharing above the annual out-of-pocket spending threshold under Medicare prescription drug benefit beginning in 2024. And it's going to cap the annual out-of-pocket spending at $2,000 in 2025 with COLA adjustments thereafter. It's also going to establish a program under which drug manufacturers provide discounts to beneficiaries who have incurred costs above the annual deductible beginning in 2025. So trying to reduce the total annual out-of-pocket spending for the beneficiaries of Medicare and Medicaid, great, but this doesn't go into effect until 2025. The bill also provides funds through fiscal year 2031, again, for those changes and implementation requirements. It also establishes a process through which certain beneficiaries may have their monthly out-of-pocket costs capped and paid monthly installments beginning in 2025, and it provides funds for the fiscal year of 2023 for the CMS to implement this process. So it's going to provide funds next year for these processes for prescription drug price kind of capping and regulation. But again, this is not going to go into effect for a year when right now, currently, the U.S. economy is experiencing one of the highest rates of inflation we've seen since the 1970s. This bill is also going to establish a series of additional programs and requirements relating to the coverage under the Medicare prescription drug benefit and other programs. For example, the bill is going to eliminate cost sharing under the Medicare prescription drug benefit for adult vaccines that are recommended by the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. It also requires coverage without cost sharing of such vaccines under Medicare and Medicaid for the Children's Health Insurance Program. So trying to bring affordable vaccinations to all those that want them, I think a good thing. However, most of the time, these vaccines are already relatively cheap. So what it's actually trying to accomplish here, hard to say. The bill is also going to cap cost sharing under the Medicare prescription drug benefit for a month's supply of covered insulin products for 2023 through 2025 at $35, and beginning in 2026, $35, 25% of the government's negotiated price, or 25% of the plan's negotiated price, whichever is less. I think this is a really great aspect of trying to get insulin prices under control in the United States. It is absolutely wild how hard it is for these drugs to be acquired by people that simply need it to survive, and something that is going to be very beneficial. I think this right here is actually a very, very good thing that's coming out of this this bill, which will hopefully, again, try to reduce costs. Because when you're talking about someone that needs to buy their insulin or either needs to buy food or pay rent or buy their insulin at $1,000 a month, it is absolutely just an impossible position to put people in. So I think something that actually addresses the absolutely exorbitant cost of this life-sustaining drug is very good. And the fact that this goes into effect for this year and goes into full effect in 2023 and through 2025, again, I think is a very good thing and something that actually might help to reduce inflation for the U.S. taxpayer. It also includes affordable care subsidies, which extends through 2025. So we're going to actually see what that does. The Affordable Care Act kind of getting hit from all sides, depending on who's actually in power in the House and Senate. So with regard to subsidies for the ACA, again, it is what we have right now, and we're just going to kind of see how that has to play out. Now, under the economic security, we also have energy security being written in. This bill modifies and extends through 2024 tax credits for producing electricity from renewable resources, specifically for wind, biomass, geothermal, and solar, landfill gas, trash, qualified hydropower, and marine hydrokinetic resources. I had to look up what marine hydrokinetic resources were when I was looking into doing this podcast, and essentially that is wave energy, which I thought was kind of cool. This also provides provisions for investment in certain energy properties, such as solar, fuel cells, waste energy recovery, and the like, and for alternative fuel mixtures and biodiesel and renewable diesel. So what exactly is this going to mean? Hopefully this actually does increase people wanting to change to more renewable resources. However, the problem is that the use of these types of energy, such as solar or other things that the individual taxpayers are going to maybe want to implement on their own properties, is very expensive to begin with. And current projections on what these tax credits are going to look like are nowhere near what is going to help to offset that. So are people actually going to benefit this that are actually suffering from inflation? Probably not. So maybe a little bit of a miss on that part. Now, it's also going to create tax credits for qualifying zero-emission nuclear power units sold after 2023. The sale of mixed sustainable aviation fuel beginning in 2023. The production of clean hydrogen, the production of clean electricity for investment in zero-emission electrical generation facilities or storage facilities, and domestic clean fuel production beginning in 2025. I'm personally a very big fan of nuclear energy. Yes, it does have some drawbacks, but with regard to how much it can produce for how cheap and also the environmental impact in general of nuclear energy, I think this is a very good thing. However, the problem is that we're really not writing any permits, and the development of nuclear energy has hit kind of a huge wall in the United States. After things like the Fukushima Daiichi plant disaster in 2011 in Japan and other different nuclear accidents around the world, we saw a very big slowdown in the actual permitting of new nuclear facilities in the United States. Currently, nuclear energy produces roughly 19% of the U.S. Electrical load, and it also is projected to be reduced over the next 15 to 20 years as permits expire for the aging nuclear infrastructure in the United States. Now, something that might actually help part of this provision to help actually reduce inflation for people would be to increase provisions for issuing new nuclear permits in the United States, but that's not something that seems to be included in this actual bill. The bill actually modifies the requirements for a tax reduction for energy efficient commercial buildings, which we're going to kind of see how that plays out. It's also going to create a new credit for commercial clean vehicles and modifies the refundable tax credit for the purchase of plug-in electric vehicles and previously owned electric vehicles. It's permanently going to reinstate the hazardous substance superfund financing rate for certain excise taxes, including excise tax on domestic crude oil, imported petroleum products at a rate of 16.4 cents per barrel in 2023, adjusted annually for inflation. So with a country that is hugely reliant on chemical production for energy, so things like oil, natural gas, gasoline generation, seeing something that is going to increase anything with regard to that is going to certainly be seen to increase the cost of production and what is being paid by the consumer for their energy. So something that might actually increase inflation being included in this bill. And there's definitely some other things that kind of go into, some more fine point of energy production and trying to promote clean, or sorry, say quote, clean energy and alternative energies. So we're kind of getting to the end of what I think is really going to be things that are focused on reducing inflation for the U.S. taxpayer. This is just the first title. The rest of it generally more focuses on what are a little bit more special interest for this actual bill, and that's just Title 1 is getting through everything that we just talked about. Now, Title 2 is the Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. Again, lumping in nutrition and agriculture and forestry into a bill aimed at reducing inflation, kind of an interesting play, but let's see what's actually included in this. The bill provides funding for the Department of Agriculture on a variety of programs related to conservation and renewable energy. See the theme is that we're keeping provisions and additional spending being related to conservation and renewable energy, which I think in general is a good thing. However, when it's a bill focused on reducing inflation, I don't exactly see the correlation. We're also seeing provisions in Title II for conservation. Specifically, it's going to provide funding to the USDA for voluntary conservation programs, such as the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, and the Regional Conservative Partnership Program. It's also going to provide the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, for conservation technical assistance, and a program to quantify carbon sequestration and carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions. Again, providing additional spending for really specific niches in regards to environmental protection, which I think in the whole is a good thing, but where does this actually kind of play into reducing the actual inflation rate for the United States? I don't really think it has much of a bearing. It's also going to include provisions for rural development and agriculture credit. It's also going to include provisions for funding the national forest system, including funding for forest restoration, wildfire prevention, related activities, and providing further funding to the USDA for programs that award grants to owners of state and private forests for climate mitigation, forest resilience, and related activities. I think only one thing in there is going to possibly help reduce costs for people, and that's going to be wildfire prevention. Wildfires actually are a serious threat to inflation and cost, because when you have these huge amounts of wildfires that cause billions of dollars worth of damages, not having insurers hike rates in places that are prone to wildfires, and people also having to pay to rebuild homes and things like that can certainly be of definite benefit. But when you bury something so small so far into a reduction act that's mainly focused, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the parts that are mainly focused on climate change, again, kind of hard to see where the direct benefit to reducing inflation is going to be. Now moving into Title III, we have the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. This bill is going to provide additional funding for the president to carry activities under the Defense Production Act of 1950. What is the Defense Production Act of 1950, you ask? Well, it's kind of interesting, and I wanted to read to you kind of the Wikipedia definition of what this is, because I think this is one of really the interesting things that is going to potentially have a lot of detriment under things that can potentially reduce inflation in the United States. So the Defense Production Act of 1950 is an act that currently contains three major sections. The first authorizes the president to require businesses to accept and prioritize contracts for materials deemed necessary for national defense, regardless of a loss incurred on business. So it basically allows the president to prioritize the production of materials. Doesn't matter if it causes a financial hardship to the business. That definitely doesn't seem like something that's going to reduce inflation. The law does not state what would occur if a business refused or is unable to complete a request on time. However, any person who performs any act prohibited or willfully fails to perform any act required by the Defense Production Act may be charged with a felony it results in fines and up to $10,000 imprisonment for up to 1 year or both. The second section authorizes the president to establish mechanisms such as regulations, orders, or agencies to allocate materials, services, facilities for national defense. And third section of the Defense Production Act of 1950 authorizes the president to control the civilian economy so that scarce and critical materials necessary for national defense and are available in order to be deferred to defense needs. So those three kind of sections being that bill being expanded is a little bit I would say frightening for the American people, for the fact that it basically allows the executive branch of the government to tell the manufacturing production capabilities of the United States in different industries exactly what they can make, and the fact that they might have to do it at a loss. And the fact that this is basically a very small snippet buried in Title III of 8 of a particular bill, again, a little bit frightening. The Inflation Reduction Act also confers on the president a broad set of authorities to influence domestic industry in order to provide essential materials and goods for national defense. Now, lumping this in, especially coming something right after something that increases spending for, relatively special interest portions of renewable and clean energy, I think is definitely going to help to increase the amount of pointed direction that the executive branch is going to give to these types of energy production and other things that are, again, I think in a national best interest, but are definitely still seen as more of a special interest segment, things like renewable clean energy, solar, biomass, and things like that. So maybe possibly expanding the ability of the government to require different companies to change their manufacturing direction. Again, a little bit concerning on that front. Now let's get into Title IV, the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Where does this play in? The bill provides funding for coastal communities, coastal marine habitats, weather forecasting, and aviation technology. It's also going to increase the funding for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, including funding for coastal communities so that they can prepare for extreme storms, weather research, acquiring new Hurricane Hunter aircraft. The bill also provides funding for the DOT for a program that awards grant projects to produce, transport, and blend more sustainable aviation fuel. So we're going to increase the amount of money being sent to study hurricanes and then also alternative aviation fuels. I don't see how this reduces inflation, but it's included in the bill titled the Inflation Reduction Act. Title V, the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. This is going to provide additional funding for the Department of Energy on a variety of programs concerning energy rebates. Again, good. Hopefully this kind of trickles down and helps to reduce energy costs for the United States taxpayer. It's going to also include funding for energy efficiency in buildings, increase the amount of money being spent on electric transmissions and advanced industrial facilities and other energy matters. I think it's really good that we're including money for energy for electrical transmission, because we do have a very aging electrical grid. But again, this is not necessarily something aimed at, again, this is more of an infrastructure thing, not necessarily an aim to reduce inflation. We also have provisions for residential efficiency and electrification rebates. Again, you would have to have the money in order to be able to do these types of repairs or upgrades to a home in order to actually be able to take advantage of some of these rebates on increasing efficiencies to a home, or be able to afford a home in general. Kind of going back to the download, we're seeing a increase to the median new home sale price of almost $500,000, but yet we're expected to see the taxpayers that already are not able to or can't afford these new homes actually increase the energy efficiency of the homes that people aren't buying. So maybe missing the mark a touch on that. It's also in this Title V is including a Department of Energy loan and land grant program. It's going to provide specific loan programs, including loans issued under the Energy Policy Act of 2005. So increasing loans that the government's going to make, loans for facilities that advance vehicles that emit lower amount or no amount of greenhouse gases. So basically giving tax credits to auto manufacturers that make clean vehicles, which hopefully might help to reduce the actual cost of these vehicles, which again is the cost of vehicles right now is hovering. A new car is about $40,000, which is absolutely wild. Is this going to actually reduce that cost? Well, most vehicles are not low or no emission. They're not electric vehicles. They're not hybrids. Most of them are still running on the standard gas powered internal combustion engine. So this section definitely not going to be something that helps to specifically reduce the cost to the U.S. taxpayer. And this kind of section includes things like, again, increased electric transmission spending, more spending for the Department of Energy on industrial clean energy demonstrations, and other, quote, other energy matters. With regard to natural resources, this is going to increase funding for water supplies. That's going to give a lot more money to the Office of Insular Affairs, which is a part of the government that leases that covers the leasing to develop energy on federal land and other related issues. It also includes taxes or excise taxes on any type of energy that is brought through federal lands. So again, something that's going to maybe increase the cost production for energy for the end user. Not necessarily something that is going to help to reduce inflation by any means. And again, just kind of some other things. I'll just kind of read through a couple of them. It's going to increase the spending on energy production on public lands, specifically excise taxes and things like that. It's also going to provide funding for drought response preparedness for the Bureau of Land Management for water supply projects. Again, this is more of an infrastructure thing, not something that's going to decrease costs for anyone by any stretch of the imagination. And also is going to provide funding for technical assistance on climate change planning, mitigation, adaptation, resilience to the United States insular areas. Which are the insular areas are American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Now, I don't know if you know this, and again, I'm being a little bit, maybe a little bit crass with saying this, but not a whole lot of people live in these places. Not to say that we definitely shouldn't be aiming to try to protect these areas. We definitely need to protect these areas and the people that live there. But as far as spending money on places that are going to help people, again, being more of infrastructure related, there's definitely not a whole lot of population there. And, the bill has specific carve outs for that. Also additional credits and licensing for offshore wind production. And the bill modifies several provisions related to oil and gas leasing on public lands. For example, it's going to increase the minimum royalty rates for oil and gas leases on federal lands, as well as offshore land for the OCS. It also increases rental rates and a minimum bidding standard for offshore oil and gas. What this means is that essentially it's going to be more expensive for energy to be produced on federal lands or for offshore drilling operations in the United States. Again, this is probably going to increase the cost of what is being produced on these particular lands, thereby increasing the cost to the end consumer, driving up the cost of the good or service used, which increases inflation. Now let's get into Title VI, the Committee on Environmental and Public Works. It includes provisions for the funding of the EPA, giving more money to the EPA to establish greenhouse reduction fund to support several programs that are going to aim to reduce greenhouse gases. So again, more of an infrastructure bill and environmental policy, and not necessarily something that is going to help reduce costs for the end user. Now, this kind of is packed with different stuff. It's going to include provisions for the handling of hazardous materials, the U.S. States Fish and Wildlife Service, the Council on Environmental Quality, Transportation and Infrastructure. The Transportation and Infrastructure one I do think is kind of interesting. It's going to provide funding for the Federal Highway Administration and General Service Administration, specifically funding for the Federal Highway Administration for the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grant Program, which essentially is trying to make surface streets more accessible and have more direct traffic and better transportation quality to unserved communities, which I think is good. But again, kind of going back to it, it is infrastructure, not inflation reduction related. Title VII is covering Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. It is going to increase funding for the Department of Homeland Security, specifically for maintaining sustainability environmental programs. Kind of seems to be a little bit outside the scope of that department's actual focus. The U.S. Postal Service is going to get more money for the for purchasing zero-emission delivery vehicles and installing related infrastructure. And the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, is going to get assistance under the Robert Stafford Disaster Relief Emergency Assistance Act, which is kind of a long way of just saying that is going to get more money for the purchases of low-carbon building materials, as well as incentives that encourage low-carbon and net zero energy products. Now, Title 8, which is kind of the most interesting one that I think tacked on, is a committee on Indian affairs. This bill is going to provide additional funding assistance to Indian tribes to address climate change. So I think you can kind of see a general theme of this, Title 1 being direct deficit reduction by increasing the alternative minimum tax on corporations over $1 billion, increasing an excise tax of 1% on the stock purchase buyback program. I think are two ways that might actually definitely help to reduce inflation by trying to kind of mitigate and help generate more revenue from other places to maybe help ease the burden on the U.S. taxpayer. I think the one portion of this Inflation Reduction Act that might actually do something is the negotiation on prescription drug prices, which healthcare being one of the largest segments of the U.S. economy that people have to pay a lot of money for, being able to kind of help to stabilize drug prices, again, probably a pretty good thing. But now kind of getting out of that, we have, so basically Title 1 kind of covering all of that. And then Titles 2 through 8, basically just kind of including a lot of things for infrastructure improvements and renewable and clean energy resources, and not a whole lot of things actually being done to combat inflation. So I wanted to kind of give a deep technical dive on this bill on exactly what it is and, the actual specifics being written into the bill, with kind of leaving maybe a little bit less of the opinion out of it, because listening to the news in today's climate, if you're on one side of the aisle or other, you're going to get a very, very shaded view of what exactly this is and isn't. But I wanted to actually read the facts, read through the bill. I've actually read through the whole thing. It was not exactly the most entertaining reading I've ever done in my life. But I wanted to actually kind of give you a resource for seeing what is actually written into this thing, and not just taking the talking heads at face value of what's actually in the Inflation Reduction Act. Does this act actually include things that are going to help reduce inflation? Yeah, certainly it does. Does it include more things that might be more geared towards special interest? And when I say special interest, I'm not trying to demean anything, but it is definitely more of an interest of a subset of lawmakers and different interests in the United States. Yes, it certainly does include things like that. Are these necessarily bad things? Absolutely not. Trying to have things that affect transportation and housing and urban development, and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, and help to preserve the ecology of the United States and help reduce climate change. These are all really good things. However, when they're baked into a bill titled the Inflation Reduction Act, I do believe it is a little bit disingenuous on behalf of the lawmakers. So understanding what this bill does include and whether or not it's actually going to reduce inflation, I think is very important. And I hope everyone found this at least informative. Maybe it's not the most interesting or engaging topic in the world, but I think it's really good to have a resource where, just kind of the facts are presented, and it allows you to kind of go forth from there and form your own opinion on it. And, hopefully allow you to be more informed when it comes to, your engagement with politics and understanding how these bills and laws affect you. With that said, my name is Alex Perney. This has been the Alternative Investment Advantage podcast. Thanks for joining, and have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. Tune in next week for more investing tips and strategies.
Want to hear more episodes of the Alternative Investing Advantage? Search podcast at advantaira.com and subscribe.